Mid-1943, a team of ballistics analysts at Army Air Force's Material Command begins examining a peculiar data set, gun camera footage from 847 aerial engagements recorded over the European theater during the first 4 months of the year. They're searching for evidence of equipment reliability, checking whether the Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns are performing to specification. Instead, they discover something that can't be explained by mechanical failure. In 96% of recorded engagements, rounds fired from these weapons, among the most reliable ever manufactured, fail to come within 20 feet of their targets. This isn't random scatter. When the analysts segment the data by attack profile, a clear pattern emerges. For crossing targets, enemy fighters flying perpendicular to the gunner's line of sight, the majority of rounds pass through airspace behind the target's tail. For approaching targets, rounds pass through space the aircraft had occupied a third of a second earlier. The bullets are flying true. The guns are functioning perfectly. But virtually nothing is being hit. The team begins eliminating hypotheses systematically. Hypothesis 1, weapon misalignment. They pull guns from returning bombers and test them on ground ranges using fixed mounts. Accuracy proves exceptional, under 1 minute, but of angle at 200 yards. When these identical weapons are fired at stationary targets, hit rates exceed 85% at equivalent combat distances. Equipment hypothesis, rejected. Hypothesis 2, ammunition manufacturing defects. Ballistic tests show .50 caliber rounds from Lake City, Army Ammunition Plant, demonstrate high consistency with velocity variation under 2% between production lots. Every round performs to specification. Ammunition hypothesis, rejected. Hypothesis 3, inadequate marksmanship training. Ballistics research from the 1920s had precisely predicted this problem as aircraft speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour. But between classroom theory and combat reality lies a gap that conventional instruction cannot bridge. A March 1943 study quantifies the catastrophe in stark terms. Trained aerial gunners achieve hit rates below 4% against crossing targets flying at speeds between 250 and 350 miles per hour. 4%. Consider what this means for a typical engagement. In 10 seconds of combat, a gunner can fire approximately 130 rounds. The Browning M2 cycles at roughly 13 rounds per second. With a 4% hit rate, only 5 bullets will likely strike the target. 550 caliber hits are insufficient to down a Focke-Wulf WWII or Mitsubishi Zero. Both aircraft were designed to absorb significant combat damage and continue fighting. German and Japanese fighters could often sustain dozens of hits and still make it home. This isn't merely a technical problem. This is an existential crisis for Allied daylight bombing strategy. If bomber formations cannot defend themselves effectively against fighter attacks, the entire doctrine of precision daylight bombing collapses. Operational data from the European Theater of Operations in mid-1943 paints a grim picture. Bomber loss rates reach 5.2% per mission, for air crewmen required to complete 25 missions to finish their tour of duty. The statistical probability of survival calculates to just 27% survival rate. 3 out of 4 air crewmen will not make it home. These are casualty rates higher than infantry assault troops, higher than submariners, among the most dangerous assignments in the Second World War. And this isn't the inevitable brutality of conflict. This is a predictable, preventable crisis nursed by institutional complacency and a fundamental misunderstanding of human cognitive limits. To understand why this crisis exists, we must examine the physics behind deflection error, the unforgiving mathematics that transformed human instinct into a lethal liability. Consider a typical engagement scenario in detail. A waist gunner stands at his station aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress, cruising at 25,000 feet over Bavaria. Through his small window, he identifies a Focke-Wulf WWII approaching from the 4 o'clock position. Estimated range, 400 yards. The German pilot executes a beam attack, a perpendicular assault from the side maintaining a 90-degree angle relative to the bomber's heading. This is the geometry where deflection error becomes most pronounced and most deadly. The ballistics are straightforward but unforgiving. 50 caliber round exits the Browning M2 barrel at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,900 feet per second. At 25,000 feet altitude, the air is considerably thinner, only 37% of sea level density. This reduced air resistance means slower velocity decay. For calculation purposes, we can use an average velocity of 2,850 feet per second over the 400-yard distance. 400 yards equals 1,200 feet. At 2,850 feet per second, the bullet requires 0.42 seconds to cover that distance. 0.42 seconds, less than half a second. Humans perceive sub-second intervals as essentially instantaneous. Our subjective experience of time compresses anything under about 300 milliseconds into right now. But in the physics of aerial combat, 0.42 seconds represents an eternity, because while that bullet is in flight, the target doesn't remain stationary. The Focke-Wulf WWII flies at a typical combat speed of 380 miles per hour, among the fastest fighters in the Luftwaffe inventory, converting to feet per second. 380 miles per hour equals 557.3 feet per second. During the 0.42 seconds the bullet spins airborne, the WWII travels exactly 234 feet. 234 feet. That's 78 yards, more than 3/4 the length of an American football field. For spatial perspective, consider that an FW-190 measures 29 feet long from propeller spinner to tail. In the time the bullet flies from gun muzzle to target distance, the aircraft moves forward 8 times its own length. Now visualize the gunner's task. He must place his crosshairs not on the visible fuselage of the Focke-Wulf, the thing his eyes see, the thing his evolutionary instincts scream at him to shoot, but on a point in completely empty sky, 234 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose, along its current trajectory. From his position in the waistgun window, looking perpendicular to his bomber's fuselage, this equates to aiming at nothingness, pure empty air, that he can only estimate based on his visual assessment of target speed and angle. All of this must be processed mentally, while both he and the target are maneuvering in 3 dimensions, typically in turbulent air, with his oxygen mask fogging his vision at an ambient temperature of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with his aircraft bucking through flak damage while German cannon shells are tearing through his bomber's aluminum skin. From the gunner's perspective, at 400 yards distance, leading the target by 234 feet translates to approximately a 32-degree deflection angle. To visualize what this means, if the target appears at the 3 o'clock position, perpendicular to his right, he must aim toward approximately the 12:30 position on a clock face, nearly 45 degrees offset from the actual visible target. He's shooting at empty sky, trusting that the target will fly into his stream of bullets. And this represents an idealized scenario where multiple simplifying assumptions hold true. The target flies level, neither climbing nor diving. The bomber platform remains stable, not turning or evading. The attack angle is a perfect 90-degree beam approach. Range estimation is accurate. Speed estimation is accurate. In actual combat, none of these conditions exist simultaneously. Fighters jink. Sudden random direction changes to spoil aim. Bombers turn within their formations. Ranges change every fraction of a second as aircraft close or separate. Target speeds vary as pilots apply power or bleed energy in maneuvers. Every single one of these variables modifies the required deflection angle, and all of them change continuously throughout the engagement, multiple times every second. The human brain is not designed to perform these calculations under time pressure. Our visual system evolved to track predators moving at 20 to 40 miles per hour, not 380. Our motor cortex developed fine calibration for tasks requiring hand-eye coordination at human speeds, throwing a ball, catching a falling object, swinging a club. Evolution provided us with extraordinary capabilities for the physical regime in which we evolved, but demanding that a human intuitively lead a target by 32 degrees while simultaneously processing dozens of dynamic environmental variables asks for a cognitive skill set that biological evolution never needed to develop. We're asking Pleistocene wetware to solve Newtonian physics problems in combat conditions. The biological hardware simply isn't there. These numbers, brutal, indisputable, quantified through thousands of recorded engagements, translated directly into human casualties at a scale Allied command could not ignore. The 8th Air Force, responsible for the daylight bombing campaign over Europe, absorbed losses at unsustainable rates throughout 1943. The statistics are precise and damning. From January through December of that year, the 8th lost an average of 188 heavy bombers per month. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, each carrying a crew of 10 men. Simple arithmetic yields 1,880 air crewmen killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. Over 12 months, that amounts to 22,160 casualties. To contextualize this number, consider that it represents the equivalent of losing an entire Army infantry division annually, not to battlefield wounds that might be survived, not to disease or accident, but to bombers shot from the sky. Crews who departed English airfields in the morning simply never returned. Production of trained aircrewmen and replacement aircraft could barely keep pace with attrition. The mission-level mathematics were even more stark. With an average loss rate of 5.2% per mission in mid-1943, statisticians could calculate survival probabilities with grim precision. An aircrewman was required to complete 25 missions to finish his tour of duty and rotate home. The probability that he would survive long enough to achieve this is expressed mathematically as 1.0052 raised to the power of 25, which equals 0.27. 27%. In plain terms, nearly 3 out of every 4 air crewmen would statistically not survive their required tour. These odds compare unfavorably to Russian roulette played with a revolver. They're worse than casualty rates for most infantry assault operations. They rank among the most lethal assignments in the entire Second World War. For comparative context, consider casualty rates across different combat specialties. Infantry riflemen in the European theater experienced approximately 15% casualties over the entire war. Tank crewmen faced roughly 18%. Submarine sailors, serving in what was widely recognized as an extraordinarily dangerous assignment, saw casualty rates around 22%. Heavy bomber crewmen in 1943 faced 73% casualties over a 25-mission tour. Bomber crews operated in a danger regime comparable only to first-wave assault units in operations like the D-Day landings or Marines in the Pacific Island campaigns, but infantry could dig foxholes. Tank crews operated behind armor plate. Submariners could dive to escape surface threats. Bomber crews at 25,000 feet had nowhere to hide. Nothing protected them except their defensive guns that were hitting targets less than 4% of the time. The irony cuts deep. The B-17 earned its Flying Fortress nickname specifically because of its heavy defensive armament. The design philosophy assumed that defensive firepower would protect bomber formations from fighter attacks. A B-17G model mounted 13 50 caliber machine guns with approximately 5,000 total rounds of ammunition. Military planners theorized that an 18-bomber combat box formation could bring 234 heavy machine guns to bear simultaneously in all directions, creating a defensive sphere of fire so dense that no fighter could penetrate it. The theory presumed the defensive guns would actually hit what they aimed at. With hit rates under 4%, the vaunted defensive sphere proved porous and largely ineffective. German fighter pilots learned quickly that they could attack bomber formations with relative impunity if they maintained proper attack angles and speeds. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe aces reveal that by early 1943, many considered American bomber gunnery to be more of a psychological threat than an actual danger. The sound and visual spectacle of tracers filled the sky, but very few bullets found their marks. These losses weren't merely human tragedy, though they were certainly that. They threatened the fundamental strategic objectives of the combined bomber offensive. The entire campaign was designed to destroy German industrial capacity before the planned invasion of France. If loss rates continued at 5% or higher, the bomber force would need complete replacement every 20 missions. a turnover rate faster than training pipelines could produce new air crewmen or factories could manufacture replacement aircraft. At Washington headquarters, the Joint Chiefs of Staff faced mounting pressure to reconsider daylight bombing doctrine entirely. The Royal Air Force had already abandoned daylight raids, switching to night operations after their own daylight losses proved unsustainable in 1940 and 1941. If the United States Army Air Forces followed the British example, bombing accuracy would plummet. The technology of 1943 couldn't achieve the precision needed for successful night bombing against specific industrial targets like ball-bearing factories or synthetic oil refineries. The entire strategic bombing campaign, representing billions in investment, tens of thousands of personnel, and explicit promises made to Allied partners at the Casablanca Conference, teetered on the edge of strategic failure. The question facing military leadership was urgent and unambiguous. Why were trained, motivated, well-equipped American gunners so catastrophically ineffective? The answer didn't lie in ballistics or engineering. It lay somewhere far more fundamental and troubling, in the wiring of the human brain itself, in an evolutionary conflict between survival instinct and the laws of physics. Captain Harold Kleen arrived at his assignment with the Army Air Forces Tactical Center in 1943, carrying credentials that made him an unusual addition to a military analysis team. A clinical psychologist by training, Kleen had spent the previous decade studying human performance under stress. Factory workers, emergency medical personnel, law enforcement officers. His expertise centered on understanding why competent professionals sometimes failed catastrophically when conditions deteriorated. The AAF wanted him to answer a specific question. Why did aerial gunners who understood deflection shooting intellectually abandon the technique under combat stress? Kleen's methodology was systematic. He accumulated hundreds of post-mission aircrew interviews, reviewing the testimonies of gunners immediately after they returned from combat. He obtained gun camera footage from dozens of bomb groups, watching thousands of individual engagements frame by frame. He accessed medical records documenting physiological stress responses, heart rates, cortisol levels, incident reports of tunnel vision, and auditory exclusion. From this data, a consistent behavioral pattern emerged. Gunners would typically initiate an attack using appropriate deflection, leading the target with their crosshairs positioned ahead of the enemy aircraft. But as the German or Japanese fighter closed distance, especially during head-on attacks where closing speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour, something remarkable occurred. The gunner's aim point would progressively drift backward. First, his bullets would fall short of proper deflection, then shorter still. Within seconds, he would be firing directly at the target's current position. In extreme cases, tracers would actually pass behind the tail of the aircraft he was trying to hit. This wasn't random behavior. It was systematic. It was predictable. And it was nearly universal. Kleen gave this phenomenon a name: threat fixation collapse. As perceived danger increased, conscious technique dissolved into primitive reflex. The gunner would know, intellectually, explicitly, that he should maintain lead on the target, but his hands wouldn't comply. His crosshairs would drift inexorably back toward the visible threat. Knowledge evaporated under stress, replaced by an overwhelming impulse to point his weapon directly at the thing trying to kill him. Kleen's team quantified the pattern across different attack profiles. For head-on attacks, where gunners typically had less than 2 seconds from target acquisition to mutual weapon range, 89% of first bursts showed insufficient lead. By the third burst, 94% of gunners had completely abandoned deflection, firing directly at the aircraft's current position. The collapse from correct technique to reflexive aiming occurred in under 3 seconds from engagement start. For beam attacks from the side, which offered engagement windows of 6 to 8 seconds, 67% of first bursts showed insufficient lead. By the final burst, as the fighter broke away, 78% had abandoned deflection entirely. The collapse took approximately 5 seconds. In tail chase scenarios, where gunners had 10 or more seconds to track targets, 45% of first bursts showed insufficient lead, increasing to 52% by the final burst. Even with relatively extended engagement time, over half of gunners failed to maintain proper deflection. The pattern revealed a direct correlation. As time pressure increased and perceived threat intensified, technique degraded proportionally. The shorter the engagement window, the faster conscious competence collapsed into reflexive instinct. Clean's qualitative interviews provided depth to the quantitative data. Certain themes recurred with striking frequency in gunner testimony. I knew I should lead more, but my hands wouldn't do it. It felt like I was being pulled back toward the plane like a magnet. Everything I learned in training just disappeared when I saw the cannons flashing. My brain was screaming, "Shoot the thing trying to kill you," not "shoot empty air." These weren't failures of knowledge. These were failures of knowledge transfer under stress. The gunners possessed intellectual understanding of deflection principles. They could explain the physics in debriefing sessions. They could calculate correct lead angles on paper. But in combat, with a fighter bearing down on them, with cannon shells punching holes through aluminum fuselage, with friends dying around them, they simply could not execute what they knew. The gap between knowing and doing under combat stress proved absolute. Clean identified another mechanism that made the problem worse, a perverse psychological feedback loop that actively reinforced incorrect behavior. When gunners did attempt proper deflection, they would see their tracer rounds arc through empty sky ahead of the target. Their visual system would process this as an error. You're overshooting. You're missing in front. Adjust backward. Even though physics demanded they maintain or even increase their lead, their eyes screamed the opposite message. This created a self-correcting death spiral. First, the gunner would apply deflection, correct technique. Then he would see tracers miss ahead of the target, also correct, but perceived as error. He would reduce his lead, incorrect self-correction, but it felt right based on visual feedback. He would see tracers miss behind the target, now actually wrong, confirming his perception that he needs to adjust. He would continue reducing lead until firing directly at the target's visible position. Complete technique collapse. The more gunners tried to correct their perceived errors, the worse their actual performance became. They were trapped in a cognitive loop that actively punished correct behavior and rewarded incorrect reflexes. Clean conducted his research before the development of modern cognitive neuroscience, but his observations align precisely with what we now understand about dual-process cognition and stress physiology. The human brain operates through two distinct information processing systems that modern researchers designate as System 1 and System 2. System 1 represents our fast, automatic, unconscious cognitive processes. This is evolutionarily ancient neural architecture, structures we share with other mammals, developed over millions of years of natural selection. System 1 handles immediate threats through pattern matching and heuristic responses. It operates on millisecond timescales. It's emotionally driven, designed to trigger survival behaviors before conscious thought can intervene. And critically, it cannot be consciously overridden during high-stress situations. When System 1 activates, it takes control. System 2 represents our slow, deliberate, conscious reasoning. This is evolutionarily recent architecture centered in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that makes humans distinctively human. System 2 handles complex calculations, logical reasoning, and long-term planning. It operates on timescales of seconds to minutes. It requires substantial cognitive resources to function. And under extreme stress, it's the first system to shut down as the brain redirects resources toward immediate survival. Deflection shooting makes demands that fall squarely in System 2 territory. The task requires complex spatial calculations, velocity estimation, angular geometry, predictive modeling of future positions, and continuous real-time adjustment as variables change. These are quintessential System 2 functions, but the appearance of an enemy fighter with visible cannon fire triggers System 1 responses. Identify threat, point weapon at threat, fire. These are survival reflexes honed by millions of years of predator-prey dynamics. Under extreme combat stress, System 1 always overrides System 2. This isn't a training failure. This isn't a character flaw. This is fundamental neurological architecture, shaped by evolutionary pressures that cared nothing for deflection angles and everything for immediate survival against visible threats. The physiological cascade that occurs when a gunner sees an attacking fighter illuminates why conscious technique becomes impossible. First, the amygdala, the brain's fear and threat detection center, activates. This happens before conscious recognition of the threat, operating on the order of 20 to 30 milliseconds after visual input. The amygdala immediately signals the hypothalamus, which triggers the release of stress hormones. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream within seconds. Heart rate spikes, often exceeding 150 beats per minute. Blood pressure surges. Critically, blood flow redistributes away from the prefrontal cortex, the seat of System 2 processing, toward the muscles and motor systems needed for immediate physical action. The gunner becomes biologically capable of faster reflexes and stronger grip, but simultaneously loses capacity for complex calculation. Fine motor control degrades as gross motor function increases. The hands become less precise, more prone to jerky movements rather than smooth tracking. Tunnel vision begins. The visual field literally narrows as the brain prioritizes central focus on the threat, while peripheral awareness declines. Auditory exclusion occurs. Gunners frequently report not hearing their own weapon firing, not hearing radio calls, not hearing sounds of battle around them. The auditory cortex deprioritizes sound processing in favor of visual threat tracking. This entire cascade is adaptive for evolutionary threats. If a predator attacks, this response pattern increases survival odds. Blood redirects to muscles for running or fighting. Vision focuses on the threat. Fine motor control matters less than explosive movement. Higher reasoning becomes a luxury the body cannot afford. But this response pattern is maladaptive for deflection shooting. The gunner needs the prefrontal cortex operating at full capacity precisely when blood flow is being redirected away from it. He needs fine motor control for smooth tracking precisely when his motor system is being optimized for jerky reflexive movements. He needs to perform complex calculations precisely when his brain has shifted into pattern matching mode. The mismatch is complete. Biology actively sabotages the very capabilities deflection shooting demands. Consider the information processing requirements in detail. Even under ideal conditions, no stress, unlimited time, stable platform, deflection shooting requires managing multiple variables. Own aircraft speed and heading. Target aircraft speed estimated visually without instruments. Target heading and angle of attack changing continuously. Range distance estimated not measured. Relative altitude differences. Wind drift at altitude, which affects bullet trajectory. Ballistic drop over distance. Required lead angle calculation integrating all previous inputs. And continuous recalculation as every variable changes multiple times per second. Cognitive psychologists estimate that the human conscious mind can process approximately 40 to 60 bits of information per second in optimal conditions. During a 3-second head-on attack, a gunner faces hundreds of variables, changing dozens of times per second. The information input vastly exceeds conscious processing capacity. Unconscious calculation isn't merely difficult, it's neurologically impossible. The brain simply cannot process data fast enough through conscious channels. Klein's conclusion, though he lacked the modern neuroscience terminology to express it precisely, was fundamentally correct. Training gunners to understand deflection was necessary but insufficient. Under combat stress, understanding evaporates as System 2 surrenders control to System 1. Two possible solutions existed. First option, train until deflection becomes automatic. Bypass System 2 entirely and reprogram System 1 through massive repetition until proper lead angles become unconscious reflexes, muscle memory that operates without conscious thought. Second option, remove the human from the equation entirely. Automate the calculation through mechanical or electronic means that can process variables faster than biological neurons. Both paths would eventually be pursued. But before these solutions could emerge and spread through combat units, military leadership first had to confront an uncomfortable institutional truth. The crisis of 1943 wasn't just predictable, it was predicted, multiple times, by multiple experts, over more than a decade, and at every juncture, the predictions were filed away and forgotten. American aerial gunnery training doctrine throughout the interwar period was founded on combat experiences from the First World War. In 1918, air combat meant fabric-covered biplanes with top speeds around 120 miles per hour, engaging at altitudes below 15,000 feet. At these speeds and under these conditions, deflection angles were manageable, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees for crossing shots. Instinctive aiming, refined through practice, worked reasonably well. As the 1920s progressed and aircraft performance improved, training doctrine remained essentially frozen. The standard Army Air Force's gunnery course in 1941, as America entered the Second World War, differed only minimally from the curriculum established in 1925. Students spent weeks drilling fundamentals that were appropriate for rifle marksmanship but irrelevant to aerial combat: breathing control, trigger squeeze mechanics, sight picture maintenance, body positioning for stable shooting platforms. These were skills for static shooting at static targets. Practical training consisted primarily of 3 components. First, fixed targets on ground ranges. Gunners learned to operate their weapons and hit stationary objects. No deflection required, no moving platform, no time pressure. This constituted roughly 60% of training time in 1941 to 1942. Second, towed sleeves pulled by aircraft at speeds between 100 and 150 miles per hour. These provided some exposure to moving targets, but at velocities roughly half of actual combat speeds. Deflection requirements at 150 miles per hour bore little resemblance to deflection at 350 miles per hour. This represented perhaps 20% of training. Third, stationary turret simulators where students practiced tracking and trigger control. No actual ammunition, no feedback on accuracy, no sensation of their own aircraft's movement affecting their platform. Another 20%. Total training duration, 4 weeks. Total live rounds fired, approximately 1,000. Moving target exposure at realistic combat speeds, effectively 0. None of this prepared gunners for Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacking at 400+ miles per hour, or Mitsubishi Zeros executing high-G maneuvers, or 3-dimensional engagements in turbulent air at stratospheric altitudes. The disconnect between training environment and combat reality widened into a chasm as aircraft performance evolved. In 1918, average fighter top speed was 120 miles per hour. By 1925, it had increased to 150. By 1935 to 250. By 1940 to 350. The fastest fighters of 1943, like the WWII and P-51 Mustang, exceeded 426 miles per hour. Required deflection angles increased proportionally. At 120 miles per hour, crossing deflection required 5 to 8 degrees. At 250 miles per hour, 15 to 20 degrees. At 350 miles per hour, 30 to 35 degrees. Yet training doctrine remained static. The gap between what gunners practiced and what they faced in combat widened every year, and every year it was ignored. By 1942, with America fully at war, pressure to rapidly produce trained gunners created impossible compromises. The military needed tens of thousands of aerial gunners immediately, right now, not eventually. Training command faced a brutal choice: maintain rigorous standards and produce graduates slowly, or accelerate courses and sacrifice quality for quantity. They chose speed. Gunnery school duration remained at 4 weeks. Ammunition allocation per student remained minimal, constrained by production demands and competing priorities. Live fire exercises continued using the same towed targets at the same inadequate speeds. Instructors knew their graduates were inadequately prepared for actual combat. But they had no authority to extend training periods, no budget to provide more ammunition, and explicit orders to maintain graduation throughput. After-action reports from early 1942 missions began noting gunnery ineffectiveness. Training Command received requests from operational units to emphasize deflection shooting more heavily, but meaningful curriculum revision required resources that didn't exist. More time to extend courses, more ammunition already allocated elsewhere, specialized equipment that hadn't been developed yet. The easier path was to continue the existing system and hope that gunners would adapt in combat through experience. Those who survived their first few missions would learn. Those who didn't, wouldn't.